All right, Steve, go ahead.
Hey folks, I'm Steve Pygott, Chairman of the Atlanta Chapter of the Explorers Club, and we've got a wonderful evening for you tonight, and hopefully the first of many collaborations with the German and French consulates here in Atlanta. Now, this evening was originally planned to be a local chapter event here in Atlanta, but as we all know, COVID has changed things so much this year, and there's just no way to have a dinner here in Atlanta, so we've made it a virtual event. The upside of this, of course, is that we're able to share this wonderful presentation with a global audience. Now, there will be a Q&A session at the end of this, which will be moderated by Dr. Dina Weibel, Professor of Anthropology at Grand Valley State. And a big thanks to Dr. Weibel for leading that. Just make sure to those of you watching to put your questions into the online chat at any time during the presentation, and those questions will make their way to Dr. Weibel so that she can ask them after the presentation. Last, I'd like to give a big thanks to the French consulate here in Atlanta for their support, and a special thanks to the German consulate in Atlanta for the organization of this event, especially to Mika Bukta, who it's been just a real pleasure to work with on this. Now it's my honor to introduce German Consul General Dr. Heike Fuller. Heike, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Steve. Very kind introduction. The German and French consulates in Atlanta are firm supporters and believers of exploration. This is perhaps due to the centuries-long and extensive history of our scientific countries in delivering renowned scientific contributions to world development. Today, we as diplomats take the opportunity to further highlight the importance of explorers for bettering our civilization by joining forces with the Explorers Club in providing a platform for a highly respected German scientist and her work on Alexander von Humboldt. We are deeply honored that we are partners of the Explorers Club Monday Night Lecture Series as we fully embrace the club's mission to actively preserve the instinct to explore and to actively encourage public interest in exploration and the sciences through public programs. Thank you very much to all of you from the Explorers Clubs in New York. Also, a very special thank you to you, Steve, chair of the very active Atlanta chapter of the Explorers Club. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Sandra Rebok. We would have loved to invite her to Atlanta for an in-person event. However, we are even more grateful that she joins us virtually tonight so that she can share her extensive knowledge with all of you throughout the United States and beyond. Sandra is in Madrid, Spain at the moment and 6 hours ahead of us in the Eastern time zone. Thank you, Sandra, for staying up so late. Dr. Sandra Rebok is a German historian of knowledge, author, speaker, and scientific consultant. Her research focuses on exploration voyages, the globalization of science and intellectual networks during the 19th century. She has 25 years of experience in Humboldt research. She is the author of several books on Humboldt and the editor of 3 of his works in Spanish. She has also been a participant of the Malaspina 2010 voyage carried out by the Spanish Navy, where she lectured around the world. Dr. Rebok's last book discussed Humboldt's intellectual exchange with Thomas Jefferson, and her forthcoming monograph analyzes his position between the Spanish Empire and the expanding United States. In 2019, on the occasion of Humboldt's 250th anniversary, she researched on Humboldt's perception in Latin America, a project she carried out for the German Foreign Ministry and the German Institute for Foreign Relations. We are looking forward to an exciting lecture about exploration beyond borders, Humboldt and his ties to France. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Heike, for the kind presentation, and hello to everybody. It's my pleasure to be here tonight, and I would like to thank the German consulate in Atlanta, the French consulate in Atlanta, and of course, the Explorers Club. From the perspective of the history of knowledge and ideas, for me, it is always important to present Humboldt not only as an isolated person, but to show his connections to the historical moment he lived in, and to see how his scientific endeavor was embedded in the historical context. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Let's now see if it all works. Just a moment. Okay, Dina, is it fine? Can you see it well, the presentation?
Looks good.
Perfect, thank you. So looking at the people and the ideas that have inspired Humboldt, as well as the influence of the political circumstances of his time, is helpful to better understand his project and his achievements. And this is what I'm going to do in this lecture on exploration beyond borders, Humboldt and his ties to France. And now I can't pass it, just a second. It all worked when we did the testing. It still doesn't work, just a second. Okay, I have to pass like this. So the presentation is divided into 3 parts. The first part is who was Humboldt, and this is an overview of his life and his scientific mission for those among the audience who might be less familiar with Humboldt. The second question is, in which way was Humboldt different to other explorers of his period of time, but also previous explorers? So what were the characteristics of, especially of his American expedition? And what was the role of France in his life and in his scientific project? Because France played a very significant role in Humboldt's life in general. It was for him like a second home country. He lived much of his life in Paris and established a long and intense collaboration with a prominent scholarly community. So I would like to focus much more on this aspect as the main topic for this lecture. Alexander von Humboldt was born in 1769 into a prominent and wealthy family settled in Berlin and with close ties to the Prussian court. His father was a major in the Prussian army and royal chamberlain. His mother came from a Huguenot family from the region of Languedoc, and these were the French Protestants who immigrated to Prussia. Young Alexander spent most of his childhood at the family's country estate, Schloss Tegel, together with his older brother, Wilhelm, who would later become a celebrated linguist, philosopher, and diplomat, known for the model of higher education that he inspired, the so-called Humboldtsche Bildungsideal. The brothers maintained a close relation throughout their lives, both intellectually and socially. Their mother, Marie Elisabeth, pursued the best possible education for their sons, hiring outstanding personalities and private tutors. Among them were, for example, Joachim Heinrich Campe, a well-known writer, and Gottlieb Johann Christian Kund, who became quite influential, particularly after the early death of the father. Also, the Jewish community left its mark on the brothers' educational values through the salons they maintained as a privileged cultural and social space in enlightened Berlin. Later, Alexander pursued his studies at the universities of Göttingen and Frankfurt and at the Academy of Commerce in Hamburg. After that, he went to the Bergakademie, the famous mining academy in Freiberg, Saxony, which later attracted a growing number of students from other countries, including many students from the United States. So this group of different tutors and teachers and professors, they gave him important intellectual impulses during his upbringing and also in later years. And this contributed considerably to the development of his ideas and his convictions. So since he had very broad scope, very broad interest, this in part is an explanation for that. The fact that Humboldt grew up in the era of great expeditions carried out by famous explorers such as Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, James Cook, and Alessandro Malaspina and José de Bustamante y Guerra had a decisive impact on him. The adventurous descriptions of these journeys fascinated him from his early youth, and formed his longing for the exotic worlds. At the beginning, it was not clear where he wanted to go. It was basically the idea to go to the tropical world, basically where it's warm. So that was important. But yeah, also that it's exotic, far away from his native Prussia. In the spring of 1790, Humboldt took an important step in that direction, accompanying the famous naturalist and travel writer Georg Forster in a journey to the Netherlands, England, and France. Through his brother Wilhelm, he had been introduced to Forster, who had accompanied James Cook on his second exploration voyage, along with his father, the naturalist Johann Reinhold Forster. In his diaries, Humboldt described how his first visit to London, and particularly his encounter with the famous naturalist Joseph Banks, inspired him and defined his own vocation as a naturalist. In the diaries, he also admitted that Georg Forster influenced his own path to becoming an explorer. Initially, Humboldt saw the only possibility to participate in such an exploration voyage as a participant of a government expedition. So this is what he had observed with the other explorers that had whose travel narratives he had read, and this was also the normal way how a naturalist would participate in an exploration voyage. However, at that moment, Prussia did not have any colonies yet and didn't have any aspirations. So that's why Humboldt had to be open to collaboration with other nations. Nevertheless, it was not in England, but in France, where he received the first offer to participate in such a government voyage. It was then for several reasons, but we are going to return to that point later. So these options wouldn't work out. And as a next step, along with Aimé Bonpland, a French botanist that he had become friends with in Paris, Humboldt tried his luck at the Spanish court. He arrived in Madrid at the beginning of 1799. Here we see the royal palace in Aranjuez. So Aranjuez is to Madrid a bit what Versailles is to Paris. So this is the place where the royal summer palace was, and he had to go several times to Aranjuez to have encounters with the Prussian with the Spanish king Carlos IV Charles IV. There, the stars seemed to be aligned for Humboldt's scientific endeavor, also because the new Secretary of State, Mariano Luis de Urquijo y Muga, was very favorable to scientific enterprises in general, and it was him who introduced Humboldt to the Spanish monarch, who would give him the travel authorization or the authorization to travel at his own cost through the Spanish possessions in the New World. And this is another aspect we will return to later. Excited about this challenging opportunity, they both left from La Coruña, which is in northwest Spain, in May 1799, for what would become the 5 years expeditions through Spanish America that he would become most famous for. So there are three things I would like to point to with this illustration. First of all, sometimes I hear it's Humboldt's voyage to South America. So he was not only in South America, but in fact visited South America, North America, and the Caribbean. And also the regions that he visited at that time, they were divided in the viceroyalties of New Spain, New Granada, Peru, and the island of Cuba. So today that's Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and Cuba. So he did not enter the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, which comprises today's Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, and the parts of Brazil. So this is where he did not go to. And also would like to point out that during the entire voyage, he was not only accompanied by Aimé Bonpland, but also from Quito onwards, the young Carlos Montúfar Hilaria, the son of the Marquis de Selva Negra, in whose hacienda outside of Quito, Humboldt had been a guest for an extended period of time, he joined the party. However, he was not a naturalist, but rather a young man with revolutionary inclinations, which led him to have an unhappy ending many years later. At the end of the expedition through the Spanish colonies, before returning to Europe, they decided to add a visit to the United States. There were several reasons for that. One reason was that after living in a colonial society for 5 years, and Humboldt was not at all in favor of that circumstances, so he was not in, there were so many aspects of this colonial society that shocked him, that he had difficulties to deal with, and he expressed that in his diaries and also in some of his letters, also in his publications, though in a more cautious way. So anyway, at that moment, he was eager to see the young democracy in the United States. Also, he considered it to be an ideal moment to visit the United States after the Louisiana Purchase and the beginning of the government-promoted exploration voyage to the American West. So Jefferson had just launched a series of exploration voyages that started with the Lewis and Clark expedition. The arrival in Philadelphia was in May 1804. And first, so altogether, they stayed there for 6 weeks. At the beginning in Philadelphia, they were mostly connected to the American Philosophical Society. The members of the APS, they hosted them, gave them an introduction to the city, to the scholarly institutions, etc. From there, they visited Washington at the end of June and were guests of Thomas Jefferson. Humboldt expressed several times that he would have wished to stay longer. However, he needed to go back to Europe, and decided on his return, he decided to live in Paris for 22 years. However, his time in his beloved city came to an end in 1827, when for several reasons he had to return to Berlin. Shortly after his relocation to Berlin, in April 1829, Humboldt embarked on a second major expedition, which is much less known than the American expedition. It was also much less important, but in any case, it was an expedition through broad regions of Russia, as far as the Siberian borders, by the invitation of Tsar Nicholas I. This expedition allowed him to elaborate what Humboldt wanted to do since already since he was in Spanish America. So his interest was to establish a comparison or comparative studies between the New World, between America and Asia. So finally, this is what he could do through this exploration voyage, which spanned 8 months. And it also led to important scientific discoveries. However, the scholarly scope was much more narrow. It was basically limited to his studies in the field of mineralogy. And this was basically because this were the interest of the Tsar. And so the entire voyage was rather restricted. It was much under the control of the Russian authorities, and this was nothing comparable with the liberty he had in Spanish America. So Humboldt was rather unhappy about it, and when he received a second invitation to Russia, he declined that invitation. So in Berlin, the years from 1827 until 1859, when he passed away at the age of almost 90 years, he was working on the elaboration of his results of the American expedition, but also the Asian expedition. And in fact, he passed away when he was still working on the 5th volume of his Cosmos. So he left behind a collection of 60,000 different plant species, many of them previously unknown, or at least unknown in Europe, an abundant assortment of geological, zoological, botanical, and ethnographical observation, also astronomical observation and a great number of maps and letters and his travel annotations. So in general, it's he published a large number of publications. It's difficult to say how many, because there were editions and then re-editions and translations and partial translations, etc. So there is a whole book that just talks about the different editions of Humboldt's works. But in any case, they have been translated to several languages, and they have been used as references by countless subsequent travelers and scholars, which shows the broad array of his scholarly interests. So now we come to the second part. How did Humboldt's American voyage differ from other exploration voyages? In his period of time, but also in the previous centuries, there were many important exploration voyages. So in general, we can say there are many important exploration voyages in history. We have those that discover new land for European imperial aspirations, like, for example, Cook's travels, or others that find new navigation routes, like Columbus or Magellan. Then there were others that had more, let's say, scientific strategic goal to inspect their own possessions. And in this category, we have to put the Malaspina expedition. Then there are other exploration voyages that led to the development of new scientific theories, like, for example, in Darwin's case, or those that had rather humanitarian goals, like, for example, the vaccination expedition of Francisco Javier de Balmes. In many times there was also a combination of different goals. But anyway, what I would like to ask and to respond is how did his expedition, how was it different from others? I didn't mean more important, because I don't want to establish any ranking, but what are the special characteristics, the unique conditions of his exploration voyage, especially the American one? And I would like to focus on 4 aspects that illustrate that. So first of all, he obtained a very exceptional travel authorization from the Spanish crown. Normally, obtaining such unrestricted travel authorization as Humboldt was requesting was impossible, since the Spanish court, like any other European power, preferred to keep foreign travelers out of their territories, or at least there, I would like to clarify, the Spanish Empire, they did incorporate foreigners in their endeavors, but always in their service and under their control. So that is a big difference. In Humboldt's case, that was totally different. There were many reasons, and I don't have time to focus on that right now, why the Spanish crown accepted Humboldt's offer, and they saw advantages for Spain to be connected to Humboldt's ambitious project, and therefore Humboldt received what but a passport, we say a passport, but in fact it was more a combination of a safe conduct and letters of recommendations, together with instructions to all Spanish officials. So it allowed him to enter not only the Americas, but also any other Spanish overseas position, for example, the Philippines. And in fact, Humboldt wanted to go to the Philippines, but then he postponed the Asian part for later. That he was allowed to undertake all types of observation and studies that he considered useful. So the wording of the document was absolutely open, absolutely generous. It also explicitly instructed all Spanish administration officials to avoid any complications for Humboldt, and specifically allowed him the free use of scientific instruments for all observations with no restrictions. Humboldt made sure that phrasing was inserted in the passport, because while he was in Spain, he had sometimes difficulties when he was doing his measurements with the scientific instruments he had brought from Paris. So he had difficulties with the rural population, etc. So that's why he made sure that that he could use everything. And the only condition for this generous passport was that he should enrich the collection of the two most important scientific institutions in Madrid, the Royal Real Gabinete. So that was going to be the Natural History Museum and the Royal Botanical Garden in Madrid. I would also like to point to the fact that Humboldt did not receive any financial contribution for his exploration voyage. He financed it all out of his own pocket, and he did not travel in the service of the Spanish court. I would like to focus on that because sometimes this has been misunderstood. So this was rather unique in an era when the naturalists tended to travel as part of a government exploration voyage, and it's also important to mention that to show that there was no political power in a position to conduct his scientific enterprise or to give him any instructions. So Humboldt was very aware of the extent of the generosity and the extraordinary freedom that he had been granted. And he says, never had so extensive a permission been granted to any traveler, and never had any foreigner been honored with more confidence on the part of the Spanish government. So that is what he wrote in his travel narrative. In other words, Humboldt traveled with a maximum of liberty along with a maximum of protection. And this is on one side very unique, and it's also the key to his success. Because if you have a closer look on those conditions, it meant that he had an absolute flexibility with regard to his itinerary. And this is unusual because normally in a government exploration voyage, you would, or even if it just travel or explored for an institution, you had your itinerary, you had the time set, etc. In this case, it was all up to his own decision. So he could decide. He could, for example, if he was at one point and there were difficulties, he could not continue the way he wanted. Or, for example, when he was somewhere and then he was told that he should travel to another town or to another region and meet someone specific there. So he was always in position to do so and to stay wherever he wanted. He could stay as long as he wanted. And yeah, whenever a difficulty arose, he was able to adapt the itinerary and his work to that. It's also important because he maintained the full control over all the measurements, all the data that he generated, and all the information that he acquired during the 5 years. And when he returned, he decided what was going to be published. And this also is unusual because normally people or participants of an exploration voyage, they would get more clear assignments, yeah, especially if it's a larger exploration voyage, they would be assigned, for example, one to talk about or to publish a book on the botanical species, another one would do the travel narrative. And but in Humboldt's case, he could do everything. And that's why also he made himself much more known. Another aspect that made him, let's say, a bit distinct to other exploration or to other explorers was the fact that he had a very, very broad scientific goal. This was the holistic and global understanding of the natural world with all its interdependencies. Humboldt envisioned the Earth as an indivisible organic whole, all parts of which were mutually interdependent. Already before departing from Madrid, in a letter, he defined as a sole purpose of his expedition to investigate, I quote, how all natural forces are woven together and to study the influence of the dead nature on the animated creation of plants and animals. So understanding these connections and their structures was far more important to Humboldt than making a contribution to a specific field of knowledge. And this is what led to what today we understand under the term Humboldtian science. And this stands for global thinking, for an understanding that big questions of his time had to be solved in a transdisciplinary approach. So from knowledge, combining knowledge from different fields. He also connected different corps of knowledges, colonial knowledge with Creole knowledge, with indigenous knowledge, European knowledge, American knowledge. He had a very comparative approach. He constantly compared data with regard to specific regions or disciplines. And in his way to communicate or to disseminate his science, he very much used textual and visual transmissions of the knowledge. And here we see an example that, in my eyes, illustrates well Humboldtian science, because it shows that, well, first of all, we see the global scope, but also with the mountains on top, we see that, first of all, he was interested in seeing different plant zones. Yeah, so what type of plant would grow under what circumstances, and for example, the level where the snow starts, at what height does that happen, and not only for each mountain itself, but then here the comparative approach comes in, because for him it was interesting to see, so how was that in the Alps as compared to the Andes and as compared to Tenerife or to the Himalaya. So this is typical Humboldtian questions. Also, in his contribution to the sciences, he had a very broad scope. So while other explorers normally had a more narrowly defined task, they were responsible for a specific part of the exploration voyage, like botanist, zoology, cartography, or the artist who did the paintings. Humboldt, as an independent scholar, had to combine all those tasks, all those concerns together with Bonpland. But on the other side, it also meant that he didn't have to follow any instructions or have to comply with the interest of any institution. In consequence, if we look at Humboldt, we should not see him only as an explorer or only as a naturalist, because his scope was much broader than that. He also had a strong interest in social, cultural, economic, and political questions. He also did a lot of archival work, so we can also consider him to be a historian. Besides being an expert in mining, and for example, when he was in New Spain in Mexico, the city of Mexico, he closely collaborated with the mining school there. He prepared reports. He was even involved in the teaching in this institution. And besides that, also as an artist, he had a training as an artist, so he prepared sketches of plants, animals, monuments of landscapes, etc. So after his return to Europe, his contribution to the sciences became even broader. He became an active promoter of scientific projects, among them large-scale projects in which he tried to involve different governments. He also, he complied with tasks that today we would call it's science management or science dissemination or even science diplomacy. And I'm going to give more examples for that later when I talk about France. Humboldt was a great synthesizer of information who continuously connected data he himself elaborated with the work of others. His brother Wilhelm described those specific skills in the following way. And we can see that he knew his brother well. So he said, Alexander is made to combine ideas, to see chains of things that without him would have passed through the ages, undiscovered, incredible depths of thinking, unattainable vision, and the rare speed of the combination. The last of the 4 points has to do more with his personality. So Humboldt was a very charismatic personality. He apparently was also very entertaining. This is at least what people told about him, people who had the pleasure of gathering with him. And but even more importantly, he was a very farsighted or even visionary person with outstanding diplomatic skills. He had very influential networks and was very lucky in many senses. So with this combination of skills, he managed to escape several dangerous situations and avoid minefields in the first place that had brought to fall other explorers. I would like to show one example to illustrate this, and this was the Malaspina expedition, commanded by Alessandro Malaspina, who was of Italian origin, and José de Bustamante y Guerra. So it was commissioned by the Spanish crown, and it pursued both scientific and political goals. And as we can see on the map, it has a rather broad regional scope. It was a very successful exploration voyage for 5 years. They brought back a lot of material. However, after returning to Spain from America, Asia, and Australia, Malaspina was first well received and honored, but shortly afterwards he became involved in court intrigues. He was arrested on charges of plotting against the state, and after a trial in 1796, he was imprisoned in the isolated fortress of San Anton in La Coruña. And La Coruña, as I mentioned before, happened to be the port where Humboldt set off on his voyage to the New World. So while leaving the harbor in direction of the Canary Island as a first stop on his way to South America, Humboldt passed the fortress and wrote, he would have wished to have fixed my thoughts on some objects less affecting and more reconciling with humanity. And I think in the letter it was where he said, well, poor Malaspina, he had managed to escape so many difficult or dangerous situations in all the different parts of the world, but then he did not manage to escape the dangers of Spanish politics. So being confronted in such a direct way with the Italians' unfortunate fate had a considerable influence on Humboldt. It alerted him to be cautious in his political comments or judgments, especially since he had a very a close connection to the Malaspina expedition, because when he was in Madrid preparing the expedition, he collaborated with several of the participants of this exploration voyage, and they were very helpful. So that's why Humboldt felt connected, and he felt very sorry for the fate of Malaspina. So now let's come to Humboldt's ties to France. This close connection of his scholarly endeavors to the political context of his time is an important point to understand his expedition and his larger scientific project. And this is what I'm going to illustrate now with the example of France. As I mentioned before, France played an important role in Humboldt's life from an early moment. His mother was of French origin. Humboldt spoke French fluently already in his young years. In fact, his first articles he published in French. And as I mentioned before, his first visit to France happened with Georg Forster just 1 year after the French Revolution. And in 1798, when he was not even 30, he went a second time to Paris, because he wanted to meet there the most outstanding scientists like Jussieu, Laplace, Delambre, etc. So he wanted to be in contact with them, and he also got for him the wonderful opportunity to read 3 of his memoirs, 3 of the papers that he had prepared at the Institut National, which is a very prestigious institution. And there he had the possibility to impress the people that listened to him, because he knew a lot and he was very precise in his explanations. So this is why when France was preparing a scientific expedition, they thought about Humboldt and inviting him. So this is what we can see here. This is when in the same year, the French government planned to carry out a voyage to the Pacific. And Humboldt was invited to form part of the group of distinguished naturalists on board. The invitation reached him while he was, well, as I mentioned before, while he was visiting his brother Wilhelm in Paris. In fact, it was Louis Antoine de Bougainville himself So the first French who had circumnavigated the earth, who extended the invitation to him. And Humboldt was very proud of this distinction. As he relates in a letter to the botanist Wildenau, the conditions for his participation in the project were extremely favorable. He was empowered to equip himself with the required instruments from the national collection, and his advice was asked regarding the selection of other naturalists to join the expedition. However, things did not continue in such a promising way. First, the French Directory decided to replace Bougainville, who was almost 70 years old at that moment, to replace him as a commander of the enterprise with the much younger but also less experienced explorer, cartographer, and naturalist Nicolas Thomas Baudin. And Humboldt expresses in his diaries, he expresses that he was not pleased with this change. More difficulties were to come for economic and political reasons and other reasons. The venture was first delayed and then faced more obstacles. So at a certain point, it seemed that it was not going to depart. As Humboldt in that moment, he was in the situation that he had received a considerable family inheritance because his mother had passed away a few years prior to that. So he was in the situation to decide that all these obstacles were no hindrance to him, and that he was trying to continue his way on his own. On his own, that case means that he convinced his new friend Bonpland to come with him, and Humboldt covered also the expenses for him. At the same time that this expedition was being planned, there was another endeavor that had already departed in May of the same year, and this was the French campaign to Egypt and Syria, led by the then General Napoleon Bonaparte. This expedition not only included military personnel, but also 167 cartographers, mathematicians, chemists, geodesists and artists. Some were among the most famous naturalists of France. And also Napoleon, at that moment, he had not fully manifested the megalomaniac character that he later became known for. So that's why for Humboldt, being part of such an important scientific project, or also scientific project, seemed like quite attractive alternative. So Humboldt and Bonpland, they left Paris in October 1798, traveled to Marseille in the south of France, where they waited until mid-December for a chance to sail to North Africa and hoping to join Napoleon in his expedition. Unfortunately, it was again the political circumstances that changed his itinerary, because at that moment it was a declaration of the war by the Day of Algiers, the declaration of war against France, that made this project impossible. And in addition, as if this was not already reason enough, he received the word of the plague that was rapidly spreading in this region. So once again, he was forced to reconsider his itinerary. And impatient to begin their scientific adventures, Humboldt and Bonpland decided to set off for Madrid, initially with the idea to spend the winter in Spain and then leave from there for the Orient. So this is information that we can also find in his diaries. But apparently he had already heard about the pleasant and mild climate in Valencia in winter. So the idea was to spend the winter and then continue. But once again, things turned out differently. However, this time in Humboldt's favor. And as we have seen, they continued their plans in the Spanish colonies. The famous scientific ventures discoveries of the results of this exploration voyage included the famous Rosetta Stone and a series of publications on Egypt called Description de l'Égypte, which were published over 20 years. So in that sense, for Humboldt, being part of that exploration voyage would certainly have been fruitful for him. However, I also think that both options, so nor Baudin's nor Napoleon's expedition, would in the long run have worked out well for Humboldt. First of all, they would have much narrowed down his the broad scope of his project. And I also think that both options would not have been satisfactory on a personal level. While Humboldt expresses that with Bougainville, it would certainly have been an enriching experience for him, but it is rather unlikely that his relationship with Baudin, who was known for being a difficult character when in command, would have developed without frictions. And Humboldt was aware of that. In his diaries, he says, for 3 years, Baudin would have given him orders. He says, while I would have had to adapt to his moods. So he already knew that, that finally it worked out well for him, and even more in the case of Napoleon. So that would have worked out even less. So Humboldt was definitely better off leading his own expedition instead of being part of a government exploration voyage. So now I would like to dedicate one slide to Aimé Bonpland, because, or Aimé Jacques Alexandre Bomblon, this is his full name, because he was an excellent botanist, and that's why he had been chosen to participate in the same exploration voyage that Humboldt wanted to participate, the one by Bougainville and then Baudin. But for several reasons, he always stood in Humboldt's shadow and tended to be forgotten when we talk about Humboldt's expedition or American expedition. So that's why I would like to point to his importance, and also point to the fact that that he was basically in charge of the botanical work. He collected and classified about 6,000 plants that were mostly unknown in Europe at that time. He co-authored several of Humboldt's publications, mostly dedicated to the plants, but also his travel narratives. And well, afterwards he worked as a superintendent for Empress Josephine in her gardens at Malmaison. Later he left for Buenos Aires in 1816. He decided to stay in Argentina and Paraguay, and unfortunately he was there involved in several problems until he passed away in America in 1858, 1 year before Humboldt. So at the contrary to Humboldt, who never returned to America, he did return, and then he stayed the rest of his life there. Just before leaving the United States, Humboldt wrote in a letter to Jefferson, while Europe presents an immoral and melancholy spectacle, the people of this continent are advancing with great strides towards the perfection of social conditions. So what had happened during the 5 years of his expedition, and what was the reason for his negative vision of Europe? We can see it already on the image. It is likely that Humboldt at that moment, he had just heard of Napoleon's official proclamation as Emperor of the French. So Napoleon's growing imperialistic ambitions would present a fundamentally different panorama of Europe than the one Humboldt experienced in the years before his departure. And history proved Humboldt right in his pessimistic view. In the subsequent years, Napoleon sought to establish his hegemony over most of the continental Europe, spreading his ideas by means of war. However, in spite of this new panorama, for Humboldt, it was still crucial to return to Bordeaux and not to return to Spain, because he feared that he could lose control over the material that he was carrying with him. Also there he had Malaspina as an example that he did not want to follow. So when he arrived in Bordeaux, he went directly to Paris and established there what at that moment was his temporary residence, because the French capital, Paris, was still considered the capital of science. It had the most advanced scientific infrastructure, an active academic press, and a wealth of renowned naturalists, cartographers, and artists working there. Also intellectually, it was the most liberal place in Europe. In spite of his desire to live in Paris, due to his ties with the Prussian monarch, at some point after his return from America, Humboldt had to present himself in Berlin. So that's what he did. He arrived there in November 1805, after 9 years of absence. And there, soon again, he would again cross paths with Napoleon. In October 1806, Napoleon had defeated the Prussian army in the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt. The French forces occupied Berlin and the royal family had to flee to East Prussia. In the peace agreements of the following summer, in the July 1807 Treaty of Tilsit, the Prussian king was forced to cede half of his pre-war territory. It was in these circumstances that Humboldt decided to return to France in December of 1807. How is it possible, one might wonder, that the celebrated explorer chose to live in France while his fellow countrymen were suffering under Napoleon's occupation? The explanation is that Humboldt received an official political mission for Prussia to attend political negotiations in Paris. During that trip, his extended personal contacts and scholarly networks in the French capital had helped him to introduce Prussian Prince Wilhelm to French society. And when the prince left the city in September 1808 and Humboldt's diplomatic assignment had ended, unsurprisingly, he decided to stay in Paris. The city was definitely the better place or the better setting for Humboldt's scholarly work, and this is what he put ahead of any national consideration. Nevertheless, after Napoleon's invasion of Prussia, Humboldt's situation in Paris had changed. As a Prussian citizen, he was now considered an enemy and was kept under surveillance. Napoleon's officers would open his mail and enter his apartment in his absence. In 1810, the situation deteriorated further, and he received an order from the police chief to leave the city within 24 hours to avoid prosecution. So Humboldt was shocked at that moment, but fortunately his friends and colleagues, so now this is when his important networks come in. So the chemist Jean-Antoine Chaptal happened to hold a high position in the French government at that time and managed to keep the order from being enforced. So things would calm down again for Humboldt, and he continued to live in Paris until 1827, the year he was obliged to return to Prussia, not by the French officials, but this time by his exhausted funds and the calling of the Prussian king. During the time he still remained in Paris, he closely collaborated with the most outstanding French scholars, among them François Arago, the mathematician, physicist, and astronomer, or Joseph-Louis Gay-Lussac, the chemist and physicist. He published also most of his publications in French, because after all, he pursued a global project, and so he wanted to work wherever it was more promising for his work. After his return to Berlin, besides continuing with his numerous scholarly tasks, he served Frederick William III of Prussia and later his successor Friedrich Wilhelm IV as an advisor, court chamberlain, and as a diplomat. As we have seen before, already in 1807, Humboldt had received a diplomatic mission to accompany the peace negotiations, and over the next decades, the Prussian crown would continue to make use of his famous citizen and his excellent networks and diplomatic skills. So they entrusted him with specific commissions. Some of them were situated more in the imminent interest of the court. Others concerned more broader political or even scholarly goals. So Humboldt tended to comply diligently with all of them, with an eye on connecting them to his own pursuits. In particular, he was entrusted as a royal special envoy to France, the country he knew best. So his task as an informal envoy of the diplomatic stage was mainly to explain Prussian foreign policy and to keep his sovereign informed about social as well as political developments. Humboldt served, for instance, as a mediator between France and Prussia after the July Revolution of 1830, during the liberal constitutional monarchy under King Louis Philippe I. Humboldt took this mission seriously and documented his encounters with the French monarch in an extended series of diplomatic reports, of which 56 are now between 1835 and 1847. treating political questions, but also questions that focus on art and the sciences. After his return to Berlin in 1827, Humboldt developed a strong engagement to improve the scientific infrastructure and the academic setting in the Prussian capital. So in a way, this is connected with what I said before, his interest in science management and the popularization of knowledge. So this is something that grew more and more towards the later years in his life. And already when he returned to Berlin in the same year and the next year, he gave several lectures in the Sing Academy and the university, but these were lectures aimed to a broader audience at the moment when normally people would, or naturalists, distinguished naturalists, would rather prefer to keep in their scholarly circles. So that is what he did. Or for example, the Observatory of Berlin, there he got much involved to try to improve the scientific infrastructure, the instruments and the activities they had. So he became very engaged in that. And also in 1828, he organized or co-organized the first conference of the Gesellschaft Deutscher Naturforscher und Ärzte, so the German naturalists and physicians. And it was a meeting where 600 naturalists would participate. So with his intense international networks and his fame, Humboldt made an important contribution to converting Berlin in a prime location for the sciences after his return to Prussia. So we're almost coming to an end. When he was in Berlin, he, in a certain way, he could build on the efforts of his brother Wilhelm, who modernized the education with what I mentioned at the beginning, the Humboldtsche Bildungsmodell. So this happened in the context of the Prussian reform movement, and this was after the defeat of the Prussians by Napoleon. So there were several reforms, administrative, social, economic reforms, and Wilhelm was strongly engaged in the reform of the education. Today, Wilhelm's ideas are known under the term, well, in English, it's a Humboldtian model for higher education, whose core ideas is a holistic combination of research and studies. With the holistic, we can already see a tie to his brother, integrating the arts and the sciences. So this is something that Alexander also did to achieve a comprehensive cultural knowledge. This principle, in particular, the idea of a research-based university, had much impact not only in Germany, but in many other countries, also in American universities, starting with the Johns Hopkins University, where this educational and scientific principles were adopted. Wilhelm passed away in 1835, a few years after Alexander's return to Berlin. However, he had prepared the ground for Alexander's efforts. And what we see here on the image is what we know today as the Humboldt University. It was built in 1810 at the instigation of Wilhelm, but also other reform thinkers like Fichte and Schleiermacher. It was first named the Friedrich Wilhelm University, but since 1949, it was called Humboldt University in honor of both brothers, Alexander and Wilhelm. So as a conclusion or a takeout, well, I would like to say first, as we have said, Humboldt was a cosmopolitan explorer, so he can not only seen as a Prussian explorer, that would be much too narrow because national concerns didn't play a role for him. His life and his project combined different knowledge cultures, German, French, Spanish, and American. He pursued a scientific project in an intense international collaboration that went beyond all borders of nations, of disciplines, of cultures. And more than seeing him just as a naturalist, we saw in the lecture, we saw that many of his endeavors are closer connected to the task of a cultural mediator or even a science diplomat. Humboldt also made outstanding achievement for the German-French scientific cultures and diplomatic relationship, and he was a strong promoter of the transatlantic dialogue. So for those who would like to know more on Humboldt's navigation between the sciences and the politics, also in connection to other nations, to the Spanish Empire, Portugal, Russia, or the British Empire, I would like to point to my forthcoming book, Humboldt's Empire of Knowledge, from the Spanish Royal Court to the White House. More information about my work can be found on my personal website or my Instagram account, Glimpses into the History of Ideas. And to learn more about the activities of the German Consulate General in Atlanta, who sponsored this lecture, please have a look at their website or their social media channels. So thank you very much for your attention. And now we pass to the questions. I'm going to stop this and I hope to return together with Dina on the screen. So I don't know, do we have questions?
Yeah, we do have questions. First, I want to thank you so much for a really engaging presentation. I think people like to hear not just about contemporary exploration, but the history of exploration and the influence it has. So that was fantastic, and the images were so beautiful. I do have a couple questions just to start us off before I turn to audience questions. One that I was interested in finding out more about was Humboldt ended up being financed by Spain, but if he had traveled with the French instead, how do you think that would have turned out differently?
Well, first of all, he was not financed by the Spain. So this is something I would like to point to again, because let's say there have been many misunderstandings or wrong interpretations of Humboldt's exploration work, his goals, but also with regard to his connections to Spain. What I try to explain is he wanted to do his exploration voyage. And at that moment, it was not a question if you liked colonial societies or imperial aspirations of European powers. It's not a question of if you like that or not. If he wanted to participate, this is what he got, yeah. And he could not go just to the Spanish positions and explore on his own. He got to know some people who tried to do that, and he saw the difficulties they had to face. But I think the big difference is if you participate in a larger project. And with the French, it would have been the same thing. I mean, if he participates in Bougainville's exploration voyage, then he would have probably had a specific task. He would have been much narrowed down. He could not decide that now he would like to stay there longer. Now there's an interesting contact. He would like to stay 2 months in this town because he needs to exchange information. So in that, it would be, say, it would have been totally different circumstances, and that would have led to a very different outcome of his. And he probably wouldn't also have gotten that famous. Yeah, so that is what I think. I mean, we can still think maybe he would have started like that, and then later he would have prepared another exploration voyage. But the basic difference is if you do it on your own or insert it in a larger project.
Okay, and I had a question. I was curious about. Today, we have all kinds of magazines and the internet to find out about exploration. But during that time period, how did explorers keep track of what other explorers were doing? And how quickly would you find out during an expedition what they were doing and finding out?
Yeah, this is also very different in each case. Humboldt, for example, when he prepared for his voyage to Spanish America, he was very lucky because he was in the best place where you could prepare, and this was Madrid. Because first of all, the other explorers that had been exploring for Spain in the previous centuries, well, the material they had gathered this is what was kept in Madrid, and he was able to access this material, and he was able to speak with some of the explorers, for example, the participant of the Malaspina expedition. So that's why it was ideal for him. Then, since he, and also there he was privileged, since due to this general's passport or safe conduct that he had received when he was in the Spanish colonies, wherever he was, where there was important archives, he had access to the archives. So, for example, also again, I mention again the Malaspina expedition because he was really, really connected to that. So when he was in New Spain, for example, he was very happy that he also found material there on this exploration voyage. So this is material that they had left in different places, and he could see that material long before it was being published. Of course, later when they published their results, this was another means how they would circulate the information, and through the networks. And Humboldt was extremely well connected with so many different people. So that's why he got a lot of material from other people, which he incorporated in his works.
Very interesting. We have a lot of viewers tonight from around the world, including Spain, South Africa, Ecuador, Brazil. And I wanted to turn to some of the questions from the audience. So one of them, how did Humboldt collaborate or engage with the other French scientists in Paris in the early 19th century, such as Arago and Ampère?
Yeah, he collaborated with them. He in a similar way that he would, or his method that he would adopt always. That is, he was very much aware of the limitations of his own knowledge. So whenever there was a field that he was not very much knowledgeable, but he knew that he needed information, he would reach out to specific people. He would try to establish a scientific dialogue, an exchange of information. And this was an exchange where he obtained material, but he also would always pass them the material. So this is how he worked in general. Sometimes out of this collaboration, sometimes there were a few joint publications, for example. And also what he did is he used his works, his publications, sometimes as a platform to present the work of other people who would maybe get less attention. So that's why sometimes we commit an error, which is whatever we find in Humboldt's works, we think, oh, this is what Humboldt had done research on. It's a direct result of his own measurements or whatever, but this is not the case. So but he references that. So here we have to look at the footnotes. He constantly did that, and already was at the beginning, for example, with Spain. So this is when he, let's say, started his American expedition. I mean, he started in Spain, and he, in a way, practiced already the methodologies that he was going to use later. So, for example, with Spain, he looked at several works and then always compared them, because he did not only copy works of others, but he would compare it, he would calculate it, and whatever he thought was correct, he would incorporate it in his work and then mention the source. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. It sounds, you mentioned that he had certain personality characteristics that made people want to work with him, and I can see that there for sure.
Yeah.
Another question, is there a region or topic where Humboldt wanted to contribute but didn't ever have a chance?
Yes, there were many, and one big project one among several big projects where he could not contribute the way he wanted was the exploration of the American West. So this was something he was really intrigued by it. I also argue that this was one of several reasons why he went to the United States. But he expressed in several letters, he expressed his clear wish to participate. And this would have been ideal for him, because being able to explore again on his own or in a small group but not in a colonial context. This would have been ideal for him because he also very much believed in the United States, and I got it. And so this was one of his book projects that finally he was not able to contribute to that in a direct way. He did so in an indirect way, again connecting people, putting information together, serving as a hub for information in Europe, and while receiving a lot of material on the American West and then passing it to different people in Germany who would be interested in different aspects. And so that was, but there were also other projects, because he had so many projects. I mean, he always constantly had ideas and visions or things he wanted to do. And so there was more than he could squeeze in his life, even though he had a very long life and a very active life. As I mentioned before, he basically passed away finishing the 5th volume of his Cosmos. And also he tried to squeeze as much time out of his day as possible, just sleeping a few hours and dedicating his life basically to the sciences and to the advances of knowledge.
That's amazing. He sounds amazing. And it makes me think of another question that we got from one of our listeners or viewers tonight. Was he interested in geology or marine biology, or was his science solely terrestrial in focus? So I know he had a lot of interests, but did he ever do any marine biology?
No, he did not do it actively. I also don't know now, I don't want to say anything wrong, until what point he did what he usually did when he needed information to incorporate. I mean, I know that he was interested in oceanology in general, but I can't say now up to what point did he focus on those aspects and incorporate it in his works. So yeah, that's a point to have a closer look at his publications.
I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. One question says, Humboldt, it is said, was criticized by the Prussians as a defender of French interests, and the French accused him of being a Prussian spy. How did this shape his vision and writings for peaceful diplomacy within Europe when he experienced this push and pull?
This is a very good question, and in fact, this could be like a question for a lecture, like to develop a lecture, because this is and this is in fact an aspect I'm very much interested in, Humboldt between the science and the politics, and how he was being used by different political powers, but yet he established also his own way to pass information freely from one side to the other and support causes that he considered correct, like, for example, what we today understand as open science. But this, in many cases, not only in this case, but in many cases, has been misunderstood. So talking about a spy, for example, or agent, he has been accused of being an agent for the Spanish Empire, or to work in the service of the Spanish Empire. Later, he was accused of passing information to Thomas Jefferson, information that he had collected in the Spanish Empire. Later, when he, I think the fact that he was negotiating with the Russian Tsar for an exploration voyage through Russia, that this also made impossible another another important project on his lists of project that he was not able to carry out, was his exploration voyage in the British Empire. So I also believe that this was another moment when they couldn't really see where his to which nation was he tied to? And in fact, he was not tied to, I mean, yes, he was Prussian, so there were ties to the Prussian monarch, also because he had worked in the state service for the Prussian monarchy. So there were certain ties, and that's why also he could not decide on his own to stay in Paris when he had to return. But besides that, he was, that's the thing, he was accused many times of not having enough loyalties or unclear loyalties. And I would argue that he did have his loyalties, but they were not to support one specific nation over another, even if it was his own nation. So it was always, when he argued in favor or in disfavor of a nation, it was more based on other aspects. Like, for example, in his political essay on New Spain, he compares the system, again, the colonial system in New Spain. He compares that in many different categories with the United States. And if you read that, yes, you get the idea that he favors the United States, but it's let's say it's based on that data. It's based on what he considered to be the benefit of the people. What system is better for societies to prosper? So these were more his criteria. Okay. And since he has been accused of being a spy, I say my argument is that he was just the contrary. So spy means that you worked for one nation, or two if you're a double agent. Yeah. But he did not work in that sense for one specific empire or nation at all. So he circulated the information.
Okay, that sounds good. From what you said, it sounds like very much he was trying to keep things even and fair, and was very open about what he was doing most of the time.
But he caused difficulties. So this raised considerations, and people were suspicious about it, and accused him, for example, that he was also accused that he had circulated information on New Spain, or about the wealth of New Spain. And after the independence of or the creation of the Mexican nation, then there were investors, especially in Britain, they were interested in trying to get some of this wealth. And this was another point where he was accused. So basically, I think we have to think, if we want to create open science, if we think that knowledge should be accessible to everyone, it should not only be stored for the sake of one political power, then this also means that you can't keep control over the information, and you can't keep control over the purpose for which it will be used.
Okay, I'm sneaking an extra question in here because this one's from Ann Passer. And she's Ann Passer.
Okay.
She wants me to follow up on the marine biology question by asking you about the squid.
The squid?
That's what she said.
Okay.
I can jump there.
Yeah,
that's what she asked.
I'm sorry, I can't give a competent answer to this question. Do we have another question?
Yes, we do.
I can take it.
One of our viewers asked if there was any information on evidence of a traveling companion. Oh, she's asking about the Humboldt squid. There's some, I think it's the squid named after Humboldt.
Okay. Well, there are so many animals, plants, regions, mountains, rivers named after Humboldt. And we have Humboldt penguins, we have Humboldt River, we have Humboldt counties and mountains and everything, and besides restaurants, bars, schools, libraries. Yeah, so many things are named after him, and sometimes it was more connected to Humboldt. Sometimes it was just a decision of people that were excited about him. There's one thing that I can contribute, and it has to do with marine sciences. He was interested in what today we call the Humboldt current. When he did measurements, and then he saw a certain characteristic of this current. So he published that he commented that in his publication. So about the temperature, etc. And he found that this is the stream. But then the stream was named after him. And there is one, I think it's a letter where he says, well, that the current has been named after me, but to the local people since 300 years, they knew about that phenomena. I was just the first to, let's say, to spread that information in Europe, or to add concrete data. So this is something which I liked about him, that in several occasions he points to the fact that that what he writes or describes, that this sometimes it wasn't him who discovered that, but it was local knowledge. Local people always, like fishermen and sometimes the children, they all knew about it. It was just him who made that knowledge accessible in Europe, or he put it on the international platform. He converted local knowledge into global knowledge.
Okay, and we have time for one more question. And one of our viewers said, I believe Humboldt had a traveling companion who accompanied him on many expeditions. Can you speak more about this?
No, not on many expeditions. It was in each expedition, there was a different set of travel companions. I mentioned some of them. I mean, he did his first international travel with Georg Forster. Then the American expedition was with Aimé Bonpland and Carlos Montúfar, as I mentioned. So sometimes during the expedition, there were other people who joined the party for a while, and then they departed again. But there was no companion that.
Okay, I may have
accompanied him.
Question, but I almost got the impression it was a special friendship or somebody he was especially close to that he had traveled with. But
well, I mean, Bonpland, he was very close with Bonpland because he got to know him while they were both waiting in Paris for the Bougainville and then Baudin expedition to start. Then this is where they became friends. Then they traveled together for 5 years. And then also in Paris, they were collaborating on parts of the oeuvre of the series of publications. So they had strong connections. And also when Humboldt, when Bonpland later went to America, he had difficulties there. So Humboldt tried to intervene and help him. But yeah, so the longest connection would be Aimé Bonpland. And that's why I dedicated him a slide, because as I mentioned, we have the tendency to talk only about Humboldt's expedition and Humboldt, but we have to point to the fact that even if Humboldt he paid for the expedition, his scope was much larger than that. Bonpland basically focused on the plants, but still, I mean, he had made an important contribution and should be mentioned,
Okay, and stemming from that international collaboration, we're also doing an international collaboration with your talk tonight. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Sandra Rebok. And also I'd like to give thanks to the German consulate in Atlanta, the French consulate in Atlanta, Stephen Pygott, Heike Fuller, Micah Buchta, Anna Passer, and Kevin Murphy, and everyone else who's been involved in this. And thanks to so many people who've been watching tonight and participating. And we also want to let you know that on Monday, next week, Monday, at 7 o'clock, our presentation will be Exploring Submarines, Past, Present, and Future. This is hosted by James Delgado, and the speakers will include Captain Alfred McLaren, Rachel Lance, and Ines McCartney. So that'll be at 7 o'clock on Monday. And thank you again so much, Dr. Rebok, and this was fantastic, and really, really enjoyed talking to you about this and hearing all about Humboldt and his travels and research.
My pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me. Bye to everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.